The crystalline spires of the grand conclave of Xylos cast long, unsettling shadows across the polished obsidian floor, the light refracting through the massive, mile-high vaulted ceiling in fractured spectra of violet and cold silver. An oppressive silence, heavier than the gravity compensators struggled to maintain, blanketed the assembled hierarchy, 100 species bound by the fragile treaties of the Galactic Accord. At the focal point of the vast circular chamber, the holographic projection shimmered, displaying the single, stark data packet that had paralyzed interstellar politics for 3 cycles. A transmission originating from the periphery of the Orion Arm, a zone long designated as a quarantine perimeter due to the volatile, self-destructive nature of its dominant Class M planet. This planet, designated simply as Terra. Elder Progenitor Xyler of the Cathar Consensus leaned forward, the delicate, chitinous armor plating around its ocular cluster clicking softly in the otherwise perfect stillness. Xyler, whose species had charted the currents of vacuum energy for millennia, felt a profound, unsettling dislocation. The transmission was not a plea, not a declaration of war, nor even a coherent mathematical proof, which would have been predictable. It was a distress signal, brief, mathematically pure, and brutally efficient, a beacon of desperate intelligence followed instantly by the jarring, unexpected silence of the void where the source had been. But the source was not silent now. It was moving. The temporal signature decay rate is inconsistent with known relativistic travel models, intoned Speaker Vrel of the Sylvani Concord, its voice a low, synthesized resonance that echoed the deep thrum of the planet beneath the conclave. Vrel's species relied on nuanced, predictive quantum modeling, the data regarding this Terran vessel, for it was undeniably a vessel, constructed with crude, almost barbaric adherence to Newtonian mechanics, defied elegant prediction. Their initial beacon suggested extreme duress, a civilization collapsing under its own internal pressures, yet the subsequent energy signature spike indicates a controlled, near-instantaneous velocity shift that should have resulted in the complete structural disintegration of any standard hull matrix. Chancellor Gralak of the Veldian hegemony, whose species valued martial doctrine above all else, tapped a clawed digit rhythmically against the arm of its gravity throne. Gralak viewed all emergent species through the lens of conquest potential, and Terra had always been categorized as high instability, low threat, self-terminating. Instability is irrelevant if the entity is contained. The question remains, why initiate contact now after millennia of isolation unless their self-termination reached a critical juncture demanding external salvage, or perhaps external pacification? Gralak's projection pulsed with aggressive red highlights, a visual representation of its inherent martial paranoia. A wave of collective unease rippled through the chamber. The Xylosian Senate had dedicated half a rotation cycle to deciphering the psychological profile of the Terrans, and every analysis returned the same maddening contradiction. They possessed a volatile, almost feral internal history, endless cycles of internecine conflict, rapid technological leaps fueled by necessary survival, and a bizarre, self-contradictory ethical framework. Yet they navigated the mechanics of spaceflight with a terrifying, almost accidental precision. "We must re-examine the initial distress beacon," interjected Luminary Arya, the designated ambassador for the diplomatic corps. Arya of the ethereal Veloran Mindweavers floated slightly above the floor, her form shimmering with collected psychic energy. The Terran distress call was not encoded for galactic standards. It was an appeal rooted in a specific, localized cultural context. It translated crudely as "Mayday, Mayday, we are under attack." Attacked by whom, if they are the only advanced species in that localized volume? Xyler focused its multiple optical sensors on the projected image of the approaching object. It was an artifact of crude efficiency, not the sweeping, elegant arcs of established interstellar drives, nor the smooth, almost organic lines of bioengineered hulls common among the younger races. This was a stark, angular construction of dense metals, scarred by atmospheric re-entry and haphazardly augmented with energy conduits that pulsed with a raw, unfiltered power signature, a technological adolescence captured in metal. It was, by all established metrics of sophisticated spacefaring, an atrocity, yet it was undeniably functional. "It is a ship progenitor," Gralak stated with grim finality. "A military transport, perhaps, or a salvage hauler. Its composition suggests reliance on brute force shielding over energy dispersal fields. Primitive. We should dispatch a low-yield containment unit, a sug. Question of our authority, nothing more. And risk triggering the very instability we seek to monitor, Arya countered sharply. Chancellor, their history suggests a profound, almost pathological aversion to external coercion. They react to perceived aggression with disproportionate, often self-destructive retaliation. To send a demonstrative force is to invite exactly the scenario the quarantine was established to prevent. The debate continued, a swirling vortex of caution, ambition, and deep-seated xenophobia woven into the very fabric of the accord. The Cathar, the Sylvani, the Veldian, all held their breath, waiting for a consensus that seemed perpetually out of reach. They were confronting an unknown variable that refused to conform to the established equations of galactic sociological development. They were facing humanity. Then the monitoring sensors registered the first explicit communication. Not a signal wave, not a modulated beam, but a direct, tightly focused data burst aimed directly at the conclave's primary reception nexus. It bypassed standard decryption protocols effortlessly, not because it was superior technology, but because it was so fundamentally simple, a direct stream of prime numbers followed by highly structured linguistic data packets. The chamber froze. The sheer audacity of bypassing established diplomatic layering and striking directly at the heart of the governing body was an act of unparalleled strategic arrogance, or perhaps profound cultural ignorance. Xyler authorized immediate, filtered reception. The data flooded the central interface, not as alien glyphs or complex mathematical tensors, but as highly polished, simplified pictograms and compressed universal translator algorithms that immediately began interpreting the incoming stream into the shared Xylosian syntax. The message, projected in silent, resolute text across the obsidian floor, read, "To the governing councils of the known regions, we are the United Earth exploratory vessel Argonaut. We detect your monitoring probe signatures. We require immediate assistance for our severely damaged home system. Our civilization is in danger of collapse due to external hostilities. We have no hostile intent towards the Accord. We request temporary sanctuary and repair access." A burst of incredulous murmuring swept the chamber. External hostilities? The quarantine zone had been monitored for centuries. No recorded major power had ever breached the boundary. "External hostilities," Grolak scoffed, his voice laced with predatory amusement. "They are suffering internal collapse as predicted and are attempting to leverage fabricated threats to gain ingress, a common tactic among nascent, panicked societies." "Wait," Arya whispered, her psychic projections flickering with unusual speed. "The psychological markers embedded within the language structure, they are genuine. The underlying stress metrics are consistent with existential dread, not manufactured deception. They genuinely believe they are besieged." Xyler silenced the assembly with a gesture. The projection shifted, displaying the next segment of the Terran transmission. It was a compressed video feed, low resolution but terrifyingly clear. It showed a vast, chaotic engagement in deep space. Ships, the same crude, angular designs as the Argonaut, were locked in combat with entities entirely unknown to the Accord's archives. These aggressors were serpentine, biological constructs of overwhelming scale, moving with a predatory intelligence that even Xyler recognized as profoundly alien and frighteningly efficient. The sheer scale of the destruction displayed, planets fractured, stars dimmed by obscuring biomatter, was enough to silence the room more effectively than any decree. "This changes the calculus," Xyler stated, the realization settling like ice in its synthetic veins. They were not broadcasting a distress signal for rescue, they were broadcasting a warning. The Cathar progenitor observed the Terran vessel now idling just outside the established buffer zone, a tiny, defiant speck against the velvet dark. Its movements were hesitant, its energy output minimal, suggesting it was running on fumes. It was a desperate refugee ship, but the data suggested the desperation was earned. "Chancellor Grolak," Xyler addressed the Veldian, the atmosphere shifting from bureaucratic debate to existential urgency. "Your assessment of their primitive technology seems less relevant now. A civilization capable of surviving, let alone fleeing, an attack that renders entire stellar nurseries unstable. They are either fools of unprecedented magnitude or survivors of a kind we have not accounted for." Grolak's red highlights subsided slightly, replaced by a deep, wary amber. "If they are under attack by an unknown entity of that scale, Their survival indicates a level of tenacity that warrants extreme caution. We must not grant them entry until we understand the nature of their adversary. Right. Caution is prudent, Arya agreed, her voice regaining its smooth resonance. But denying immediate aid when they are clearly wounded and fleeing an apocalyptic threat violates the core protective mandates of the Accord. Furthermore, if this unknown enemy possesses the capacity to drive them out, that enemy now knows the location of the Accord's core territories. The decision coalesced not from agreement, but from shared, cold fear. The slow burn of diplomatic maneuvering was replaced by the sharp clarity of necessity. "We will grant them a secure docking berth at Outpost Gamma 7, Xyler decreed, its voice echoing the weight of centuries of leadership. "Limited personnel transfer only. Ambassador Arya, you will lead the initial diplomatic interface. Chancellor Gralak, prepare a tactical observation squadron. Observe, record, but maintain absolute non-intervention unless their vessel demonstrates overt hostility toward the station or personnel." The projection of the Argonaut remained, an image of stubborn, hard-won survival hanging in the vast, ornate hall. The hierarchy had spent generations fearing the rise of a powerful new empire. They were now faced with a splintered, desperate remnant that brought news of a threat capable of ending all empires. The intervention of humanity had begun not with a bang, but with the quiet, exhausted arrival of survivors. Outpost Gamma 7 was a neutral staging ground, deliberately bland, constructed of standard refractory alloys designed to be non-reactive to any known energy profile. It offered no grandeur, only sterile functionality, a deliberate contrast to the soaring majesty of Xylos. Ambassador Arya approached the primary airlock with a small delegation. 2 Cathar xenolinguists, shielded against the projected biological uncertainty of the Terran vessel, and 3 Veldian security analysts, their presence a necessary political concession to Gralak's paranoia. The boarding ramp of the Argonaut extended with a grinding sound, not the smooth pneumatic sigh of recognized interstellar engineering, but the sound of heavy, imperfect machinery under strain. It locked onto the docking collar, the minute gap between the 2 hulls visible even through the thick plasteel viewport. When the airlock cycled, the environmental stabilizers of Gamma 7 immediately flared, struggling to reconcile the atmospheric composition leaking from the Terran vessel. It was thick, humid, heavy with an abundance of free oxygen, a volatile, corrosive mixture by galactic standards. The first figure to emerge was tall, slender, and clad in a pressurized environmental suit of matte gray composite. The suit was battered, scorched, and bore the scars of kinetic impact. It carried no visible weapon, but its posture was rigid, poised between exhaustion and readiness. Behind this individual emerged a second, smaller figure, also suited, and then a data specialist, carrying a thick, segmented hard drive unit, primitive by Xylosian standards, but clearly prioritized. Ambassador Arya initiated the standard introductory sequence, her synthesized voice smooth, and modulated to convey utter calm, projected through the universally accepted greeting band. "Welcome to Gamma 7, representatives of the Terran vessel Argonaut. I am Arya of the Valoran Conquered. We extend the hospitality mandated by the Galactic Accord protocols for refugee vessels in distress." The lead Terran stopped at the threshold, their helmet visor opaque, reflecting the sterile lights of the outpost docking bay. After a moment of absolute stillness that stretched the patience of the Cathar analysts, the helmet retracted, revealing a face that was startlingly soft in its structure, displaying complex, symmetrical features overlaid with patterns of exhaustion. The skin was pale, the eyes dark, intensely focused. "Ambassador Arya," the Terran replied. The voice, filtered through the universal translator, was surprisingly level, stripped of the distress metrics detected earlier. It was the voice of a functionary executing a procedure, devoid of emotional excess. "I am Captain Elias Vance, commanding officer of the Argonaut. We appreciate your promptness. We require immediate atmospheric scrubbing protocols compatible with Earth standard biorequirements, and priority access to energy transfer conduits for our core reactors. We estimate a required stabilization period of 72 standard hours before we can begin the transfer of essential personnel." Vance did not offer a greeting, did not express gratitude beyond the polite acknowledgement of "appreciate your promptness." He issued directives. Arya paused, subtly adjusting her own energy output to project an increased layer of diplomatic deference. "Captain Vance, Protocol requires an immediate, comprehensive debriefing regarding the nature of the external threat that necessitated your flight into Accord space. We need data to ascertain the risk profile associated. Ed with granting full docking clearance. Vance turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the observation ports where the Veldian security analysts were discreetly positioned. There was no fear in that gaze, only assessment. Ambassador, Vance stated, his tone shifting subtly, gaining a slight, almost imperceptible edge of professional finality. We are not seeking permission, we are delivering a vital intelligence packet, and we are requesting safe harbor for critical assets. The debriefing will commence precisely when our life support systems are stabilized. We are not derelict in our duty, but self-preservation takes precedence when facing an enemy capable of annihilating organized matter on a stellar scale. He stepped fully onto the platform, followed by the second officer who carefully placed the data core onto a sterile transport pallet. The Cathar linguist, whose species communicated via complex harmonics, projected a tentative query. Your vessel's construction suggests a civilization barely capable of sustained interstellar transit. How did you survive an engagement with forces capable of, as you claim, stellar disruption? Vance looked directly at the Cathar, understanding the intent behind the harmonic query instantly. He offered a brief, almost mechanical nod. We survived through necessity, and through application of physics you appear to misunderstand, Vance replied, speaking directly to the Cathar through the translator. Your readings of our technology are flawed because you are observing the surface shell, the transportation platform. You are not observing the core methodology. We do not rely on generalized energy dispersal fields or quantum entanglement navigation for our primary defense. We rely on focused, brute force application of kinetic energy transferred at near-light velocity, coupled with tactical misdirection derived from understanding the core psychology of the adversary. He tapped a gauntleted finger against his helmet. We are Deathworlders, Ambassador. Our evolution favored immediate, high-yield threat neutralization over elegant theorizing. Our ships look crude because their design prioritizes survivability against chaotic, high-energy impacts, not aesthetic symmetry. This bluntness was profoundly unnerving to the collected Zalosian observers. They were accustomed to millennia of measured diplomacy, veiled intent, and intellectual circumlocution. The Terrans spoke in declarative sentences about survival, framed not as a moral imperative, but as a functional necessity. Captain Vance, Arya managed, regaining composure by focusing on the tangible. We will grant temporary atmospheric stabilization access within the pressurized engineering sector of Bay Delta 9. We will require immediate, unencrypted transfer of the data core before any further personnel transfers are permitted. Vance hesitated for only a fraction of a second, an eternity in this tense exchange. He looked back at the battered, solitary ship that represented the last remnant of a planetary civilization. Agreed, he said. But Ambassador, understand this. The threat that pursued us cares nothing for treaties, spheres of influence, or the established politics of the Accord. It seeks only consumption. The data core contains the necessary warnings. Your time for political deliberation is severely limited. With that, Vance signaled his crew. They moved with a synchronized efficiency that belied their supposed technological primitivism, securing the data core and moving toward the designated engineering bay. The atmosphere in the docking bay thickened, not just from the residual Terran air, but from the unspoken weight of impending cosmic confrontation. The Deathworlders had arrived, not as conquerors, but as desperate heralds carrying a warning that resonated with absolute terror. Inside the sterile confines of Bay Delta 9, the Cathar xenolinguists, led by the meticulous researcher Tiarillis, established the secure interface for the Terran data core. The sheer volume of raw information contained within the primitive storage medium was staggering. It was not neatly cataloged. It was an explosion of sensor logs, combat simulations, desperate command recordings, and deeply personal journals detailing the final days of Earth's defenses. Ambassador Arya observed the data stream, filtering the chaotic input through her Vloran empathy matrix, attempting to find the ethical anchor points that governed Terran action. What she perceived was a society utterly fractured by internal strife, endless cycles of self-imposed ideological conflict, yet capable of coalescing into an unstoppable singularity of focused resistance when faced with absolute external annihilation. Progenitor Xylar, Arya transmitted privately to the Cathar leadership on Xylos. The Terrans are both what we feared and what we failed to anticipate. Their internal conflict has forged a resilience that surpasses measured evolution. Tian, their technology is highly specialized, focused entirely on defeating high-energy threats using principles we deemed too inefficient. Their primary defensive strategy appears to be centered around forcing the enemy to expend unsustainable resources fighting a resilient, if aesthetically crude, opponent. On Xylos, Xyler absorbed this, the internal systems of the Grand Conclave humming with unprecedented processing power directed toward analyzing the inbound data stream. The Veldian Chancellor Gralak, however, remained deeply suspicious. They speak of annihilation, yet their vessel arrived alone. If the threat is so potent, why did they not bring fleets? Why did they only send a single battered scout ship? This question was the crux of the political tension, still simmering within the Accord. When Captain Vance and his second officer, a woman named Commander Sato, were escorted into the adjoining, secured conference room, a space designed for sterile, multi-species negotiation, Arya initiated the formal information exchange. Captain Vance, Commander Sato, we have begun the preliminary scan of your core data. We have identified signatures matching the kinetic projectiles displayed in your combat recordings. These objects, your railgun slugs, approach velocities that challenge our predictive shields. However, your energy dispersal signature suggests immense thermal waste. How do you sustain such output without immediate reactor meltdown? Arya asked, her tone seeking technical reassurance. Vance leaned back slightly in the provided ergonomic chair, his expression unreadable beneath the environmental conditioning of his light armor. Sato stood rigidly behind him, her gaze unwavering. Ambassador, you view energy consumption through the lens of efficiency within a stable environment, Vance explained, his voice calm, almost didactic. We do not operate in stable environments. Our evolutionary pathway, our Deathworld heritage, taught us that resource conservation is secondary to immediate victory when facing a predator. Efficiency is a luxury afforded by peace. He gestured to a holographic display that Sato activated, showing a simplified schematic of a Terran fusion drive core, a horrifyingly dense cluster of magnetic confinement fields surrounded by what appeared to be rapidly cycling, layered ablative armor. We do not rely on passive dispersal, Vance continued. We utilize highly pressurized, cascading superconducting loops contained within disposable, replaceable layers of advanced tungsten-boron alloys. When a catastrophic energy spike occurs, such as firing a primary kinetic weapon, the energy momentarily overloads the outer layer. That layer vaporizes in a controlled burst of exotic plasma, absorbing the initial feedback spike, allowing the internal system to cycle down and recharge before the next firing sequence. We accept planned, localized destruction of components to ensure mission continuity. We build redundancy into the mechanism of failure. The Cathar linguists staggered in their analysis. Building failure into the core function was anathema to established galactic engineering, which prioritized longevity and smooth operational cycles. Tiarillis projected a query filled with intellectual horror. You intentionally design components to fail under stress. This suggests inherent instability in your construction philosophy. It suggests adaptation to a reality where complete systems failure is often the only immediate alternative to total annihilation, Vance countered immediately. If we can continue to fire while losing 20% of our structural integrity, we have won that exchange. Your shield matrices, Ambassador, are designed to deflect or absorb energy signatures. Ours are designed to punch through layers of shielding using sheer, uncompensated mass and velocity, regardless of the energy cost. Arya felt a growing respect, a concept rarely experienced when dealing with species who had not undergone the rigorous, slow societal evolution favored by the Accord members. Humanity seemed to thrive on forcing confrontation into its most brutal physical terms. Captain Vance, Arya pressed, the existential threat you fled. The bioconstructs designated the swarm in your logs. They appear to operate with near-perfect hive synchronization. How do you combat an enemy that shares a singular tactical consciousness? Vance looked down at his armored hands, a gesture that suggested deep personal weariness. That is the core of the warning, Ambassador. Their strength is their unity. Their methodology is pure biological consumption, breaking down complex matter into raw biological fuel. They do not negotiate, they do not compromise, and they have no recognizable political structure to target. Sato finally spoke, her voice sharp and utterly devoid of inflection, the contrast to Vance's measured calm highlighting the difference between command and execution. The swarm processes information AC. Ross the entire engaged mass simultaneously. To defeat them, you cannot disrupt their communications. You must disrupt their physical existence faster than they can propagate the damage. We tried diplomacy, Vance added, his eyes distant, staring through the conference room wall as if seeing the void where his home world once was. We tried logic. We tried ethical appeals. Their response was always the same, the application of superior biomass. We exhausted our reserves fighting for the principle of self-determination while they only fought for the function of feeding. The political vacuum in the conclave on Xylos was rapidly being filled by dread. Gralak's martial instincts, initially primed for conquest, were now turning toward defense. If the Terrans spoke truth, the Accord was utterly unprepared for this specific enemy. Their defenses were based on energy projection and tactical withdrawal, strategies the swarm seemingly bypassed with brute force and relentless forward momentum. If they consumed your home system, Captain, Arya asked carefully, sensing the psychological breaking point, why did you survive? Your ship, the Argonaut, is not of exceptional size or armament compared to our recognized vessels. Vance straightened, a subtle shift in his posture that radiated cold resolve. We did not survive by fighting their primary forces, he stated. We survived because we ceased fighting for what we had and focused only on preserving what we could carry forward. When the final defense perimeter failed, the Terran High Command initiated Project Exodus. We were not the military spearhead. We were the surgical insertion of knowledge. He activated a secondary visual feed, a schematic of the Argonaut. It was densely packed, almost crammed with cargo bays and reinforced internal structuring. The Argonaut is not a military vessel, Ambassador. It is a specialized, hardened ark. It carries the entirety of Terran-accumulated scientific data, cultural archives, and the genetic blueprints for the entire biosphere, preserved under deep cryostasis in shielded vaults. We fled not to save soldiers, but to save the concept of humanity. This was the first large-scale reveal that resonated deeply within the Accord chambers. These primitives had dedicated their final moments not to vengeance or defense of territory, but to the cold, hard act of preserving their essence. It was a decision of immense, almost frightening pragmatism. And the SOS transmission, Arya asked, her voice hushed. Why broadcast a plea for rescue if your mission was purely preservation? Vance finally allowed a flicker of deep, personal pain to cross his features, quickly suppressed. That was Commander Sato's authorization. Protocol mandated total stealth during final withdrawal, but the command structure recognized that the swarm's victory was absolute in that sector. If we simply vanished, the Accord would assume the system collapsed and ignore the threat vector. Sato affirmed this. We transmitted the SOS to ensure that someone noticed the complete cessation of all Terran signals, a final, desperate flare into the dark. We traded absolute stealth for the certainty that the Accord would investigate the resulting void. We knew that if we arrived silently, we would be absorbed or discarded. To force your attention, we needed to present a crisis that required immediate political response. Arya finally understood the cold, intricate logic. They had played a political game with their own survival, a calculated risk of exposure to ensure their warning was taken seriously by the established powers. They had used their apparent weakness, their desperation, as a diplomatic tool. You intentionally exposed yourselves to hostile scrutiny to ensure your intelligence was acted upon, Arya summarized. Yes, Vance confirmed. We needed guaranteed access to the highest levels of decision-making. We needed to bypass the perimeter monitors and the lower diplomatic channels that would have classified us as pirates or refugees for processing. The room fell into a heavy silence. The Cathar and the Veldian delegates processed the revelation. These beings, technologically inferior on the surface, possessed a strategic depth born from continuous existential struggle. They were not simply survivors, they were masters of calculated desperation. The following cycles were dedicated to the transfer of the data core and the slow, agonizing process of stabilizing the Argonaut's crippled systems, enough for limited external access. The Cathar worked feverishly, their sophisticated sensor arrays dissecting the Terran engineering logs, finding both the terrifying crudity and the unsettling genius within. Chancellor Gralak, having observed the initial data analysis, requested a direct, secure channel conference with Vance, bypassing Arya's diplomatic filters. The conference room remained sterile, but the tension was palpable. Gralek appeared as a vast arm. Ord's silhouette projected against a backdrop of tactical readouts. "Captain Vance," Gralek began, his voice booming with resonant authority. "Your methodology regarding kinetic delivery systems is intriguing. You claim that your adversaries are incapable of adapting to sheer, uncompensated kinetic force, even when shielded against conventional energy weapons. Is this predicated on a single successful engagement or a consistent pattern?" Vance stood opposite the Veldian projection, radiating an aura of professional exhaustion that did not diminish his intensity. "It is predicated on the final, unavoidable truth of our war, Chancellor. The swarm's biology allows for rapid assimilation and replication of technological concepts, but it requires substantial physical infrastructure and time to integrate new defensive profiles across the collective consciousness. When we deployed a kinetic impact that breached their primary assimilation nodes faster than the biological architecture could compensate. When we hit them with something so fundamentally brutal that their networked minds could not process the required countermeasures in time. They were vulnerable. So you are suggesting that the key to defeating this cosmic plague is not superior energy manipulation, but superior brutality?" Gralek challenged, intrigued by the philosophical implications for Veldian doctrine. "I am suggesting," Vance corrected with precision, "that the key is applying force in a manner so disruptive to their current operational parameters that their processing capacity is overwhelmed. We weaponize their reliance on efficient, predictive absorption. We force them to defend against sheer, unthinking momentum. The logic is simple. When all else fails, hit it harder until it breaks." "A philosophy we respect," Gralek conceded, the amber light around his silhouette deepening with acknowledgement. "But if you, the Remnant, are now reliant on our support, you become a liability within Accord's space. Your presence here signals to the swarm that an area of viable, complex biochemistry has been located. You have traded one threat for an immediate, larger one." Vance did not flinch from the accusation of liability. "That assessment is accurate, Chancellor. We are now the lure. Our only asset left is the information we carried. The data core details the swarm's known propagation vectors, their metabolic requirements, and the estimated time until they can breach established interstellar boundaries if they follow the energy trail of our escape." He paused, allowing the weight of the statement to settle. "That time, based on our last sensor sweep, is approximately one standard Terran year before the Vanguard reaches the recognized border territories of the Accord. You have 1 year to integrate the totality of Terran military and engineering knowledge, the knowledge contained in that core, and prepare a defense utilizing the only proven methodology." The gravity of the situation shifted the political dynamic entirely. Humanity was no longer a refugee crisis. They were an unwelcome, yet essential, strategic asset. Their immediate demand for stabilization was revealed not as selfishness, but as a necessary step to deliver the strategic intelligence required to save the Accord itself. On Xylos, the Grand Progenitor Xyler convened the emergency session. The mood was no longer tense, it was grimly galvanized. The data packets confirmed the Terran account. The unknown aggressor was real, vast, and devastatingly effective against established galactic norms. Xyler addressed the assembled hierarchy, its voice resonating with the cold clarity of one who has stared into the abyss of oblivion. "The Terrans, whom we categorized as volatile adolescents of the galactic fringe, have delivered not a threat, but salvation cloaked in wreckage. They have proven that our elegant technological evolution left us blind to threats that prioritize visceral, overwhelming force over strategic elegance. We were preparing for a game of shields and energy beams. They were preparing for a siege." Xyler projected the image of Captain Vance, calm and resolute, standing guard over his small, vital data core. "The Terran command acted with a moral clarity we have lost in our long peace," Xyler continued. "They sacrificed their physical presence to ensure the survival of their knowledge. They did not seek to avenge their loss, they sought to prevent ours. They utilized their impending demise as a political lever to force our immediate attention onto a threat that would otherwise have arrived unannounced and unstoppable." The ensuing debate was swift and decisive. Arrogance was purged by the immediate specter of annihilation. The Accord, for the first time in millennia, moved with unified purpose. "We initiate Operation Aegis," Xyler commanded. "All relevant military and engineering branches are to be placed under a unified command structure, utilizing the Terran Data Core as the primary doctrinal reference. Ambassador Arya will maintain direct diplomatic oversight of Captain Vance and Commander Sato. They are designated essential strategic consultants, granted necessary resources, but remain under observation until the threat vector is definitively neutralized." The focus shifted entirely to the rapid assimilation of Terran principles. Cathar physicists struggled to grasp the concept of controlled component failure under stress. Sylvani logicians wrestled with the sheer lack of subtlety in Terran strategic thinking. Their approach was often brute force application until the required result was achieved. Arya returned to Bay Delta 9, finding Captain Vance overseeing the minimal power transfer to the Argonaut stasis sections. Commander Sato was directing a specialized Veldian engineering team on calibrating a containment field around the core data unit. "Captain Vance, the Accord has mobilized," Arya stated, her projections softer now, tinged with respect. "We are allocating specialized resources to integrate your engineering principles into our defense grid construction. We are preparing to disseminate your kinetic weapon schematics across the Allied military fleets." Vance nodded slowly. "That is the expected response, Ambassador. Efficiency demands rapid adaptation." "However," Arya continued, pausing before the next point, "there is one element of your final transmission that remains unresolved. You indicated that the swarm operates under a near-perfect hive synchronization. Yet you also noted that, when you successfully disrupted their physical centers, the synchronization fragmented temporarily." Vance looked up, his eyes meeting hers with startling intensity. "Yes, the core difficulty in fighting them is that they are singular mentally. We discovered that when the physical conduit is destroyed, the momentary gap in processing allows for a brief window where localized tactical units revert to near-instinctual self-preservation, rather than synchronized aggression." "And what is the psychological profile of this localized, instinctual response?" Arya queried. Vance walked over to a small, portable environmental unit, where a handful of potted, hardy Terran flora were being carefully nurtured by a biospecialist, the last vestiges of their home soil. "When separated from the collective mind, they cease to be an army," Vance explained, his voice dropping in register. "They become individuals, frightened, aggressive, but localized. They revert to the same state our own species occupied for the majority of its pre-unification history. They become vulnerable to the same concepts we were vulnerable to." "Which are," Arya prompted, recognizing the philosophical depth beneath the military jargon. Vance looked at the greenery, a flicker of profound loss crossing his face, quickly masked. "Fear, doubt, self-interest. They become capable of making tactical errors driven by the need to survive in the immediate moment, rather than the certainty of the collective goal. We learned to exploit the moment the hive mind broke, because in that brief interval they ceased to be an overwhelming force and became something that could, theoretically, be reasoned with." This was the final, shattering piece of the puzzle. Humanity, forged in the crucible of internal conflict, had learned the language of fractured consciousness, the language of self-preservation and localized decision-making, because they had lived it internally for millennia. They were uniquely equipped to combat a singular, unified enemy because they understood how to weaponize individuality. "We are not just providing you with better guns, Ambassador," Vance concluded, stepping back to stand beside Sato, the two figures presenting a unified front of weary competence. "We are providing you with the understanding of how to think when unity fails. We are providing you with the knowledge of your own species, history, the necessary brutal lessons of surviving internal fracture, and applying them externally." Arya felt a profound shift in her perception of the Terrans. They were not simply technologically crude. They were psychologically hardened in a manner that the peaceful, long-unified species of the Accord could not fathom. They were the living embodiment of necessary struggle. The next several weeks were a blur of accelerated construction and strained collaboration. Cathar shipyards began retrofitting established heavy cruisers with Terran-derived kinetic acceleration coils, massive, ugly additions that required significant structural reinforcement, but promised devastating direct impact capability. Veldian tactical doctrine adapted instantly to the concept of prioritizing kinetic saturation over shield penetration. Captain Vance and Commander Sato worked relentlessly, often foregoing the standard relaxation periods the Accord mandated for visiting dignitaries. They functioned with the focused intensity of a surgeon during a life-or-death operation. One evening, as the artificial Zalosian twilight bathed the observation deck overlooking the massive retrofit yard, Arya found Vance staring out at the chaotic, yet purposeful activity below. The Zalosian designs, once elegant and flowing, were now scarred with thick, brutalist kinetic weaponry mounts, a necessary hybridization. "Captain Vance," Arya began quietly, "you have delivered more to the Accord in a few weeks than many allied species have contributed in decades of standard treaty operation. The gratitude of the hierarchy is genuine, if politically constrained." Vance did not turn. Gratitude does not stop the swarm ambassador. Only adherence to the methodology does. We are nearing the point where the core data archives are fully mapped and disseminated. Once that transfer is complete, our utility to the Accord will diminish significantly. "And what then, Captain?" Arya asked. "Your home world is lost. Your mission, the preservation of your civilization's essence, is secured within our secured vaults. What is the next directive for the remaining crew of the Argonaut?" Vance finally turned, his dark eyes seeming to hold the cold emptiness of the void he had just fled. "Our directive is simple, Ambassador," he said. "We have fulfilled the requirement of ensuring the survival of our data. Now, we must fulfill the secondary protocol, the one we implemented upon realizing the scale of the threat we faced, the protocol we initiated when we knew we could not save everyone." A sense of cold dread, far deeper than the political fear surrounding the swarm, washed over Arya. She had witnessed their pragmatism. She had seen their acceptance of necessary loss. "What protocol is that, Captain?" Vance gestured toward the star field beyond the observation window, the vast, indifferent ocean of space where the swarm was advancing. "We knew the swarm operated on an exponential curve of consumption," Vance explained. "If the Accord adopts our methods and pushes them back, the swarm will simply seek the next viable biosphere. We bought you time, perhaps a year, perhaps less, depending on your assimilation speed. But a year is not enough to build a galaxy-spanning defense against a force that reproduces biomass like a plague." Commander Sato stepped forward, providing the supporting tactical clarity. "The Accord possesses superior shipbuilding capacity and energy technology. We possess the knowledge of the enemy's critical weakness, their reliance on perfect synchronization, and their vulnerability to kinetic overload when that synchronization is broken." "The final directive," Vance stated, his voice regaining a tone of supreme command, "is to use the knowledge gained to create a decisive, localized weapon that permanently eradicates the swarm's ability to regenerate in a targeted sector. We cannot defend every world indefinitely. The only solution is to break the central nexus of their propagation before they reach critical mass." "And where is this central nexus located?" Arya asked, realizing the terrifying scope of their intention. They were planning a targeted counter-invasion, not merely a defense. Vance permitted himself a grim, almost imperceptible smile, the closest thing to a human expression of triumph she had yet witnessed. "The nexus is not on some distant, unknown planet, Ambassador. It is the signal that drove us from our own system. The SOS we sent was not just a warning about the swarm's arrival. It was a deliberate, coded lure designed to draw the swarm's primary command structure toward the location of our final, great defense project." He tapped a location marker on the projection screen, a point far beyond the established boundaries of the Accord, deep within the quarantine zone where Terran civilization had begun its initial, disastrous probes into the void. "We realized we could not win a war of attrition," Vance continued. "So we planned a deliberate sacrifice. We are not refugees seeking shelter. We were bait, drawing the enemy into a kill zone we established years ago before the war began. The Argonaut was the distraction. The knowledge transferred to you is the contingency plan should the bait fail." Arya stared at the screen, realizing the terrifying scope of the deception. They had not fled a disaster. They had orchestrated the convergence of two galactic powers, the Accord and the Swarm, at a precise point in space, using their own ship as the magnet. You led them to a trap," Arya whispered, struggling to reconcile this layered strategy with the image of the exhausted survivors. We led them to a confrontation where our specialized knowledge could be leveraged by superior industrial capacity, Sato corrected, her voice sharp. We knew our remaining fleet was insufficient. We knew the Accord's shields would fail against the swarm's raw mass. But we also knew the Accord could build the kinetic delivery platforms faster and in greater numbers. Han, we ever could. We traded our extinction for your military preparation. Vance nodded. The true final protocol, Ambassador, involves the delivery of an artifact we prepared before we even knew of the swarm, a contingency against any unknown galactic threat that might arise near our boundaries. We designed a mechanism powerful enough to destroy a localized star should the planet beneath it prove irredeemably hostile. We were testing it when the swarm arrived. He pointed to the coordinates far out in the void. That location, which we have now signaled to the swarm as the point of highest remaining Terran activity, is where we have positioned the dormant core of the stellar disruption device. It is shielded, inert, and awaiting a specific, encrypted activation sequence. Arya felt the ground shift beneath her carefully constructed understanding of diplomacy and warfare. Humanity had not simply survived. They had been playing a strategic game on a scale that dwarfed the political machinations of the Accord. You have committed to a final gamble, Arya breathed. If the Accord activates that device, the resulting stellar collapse will certainly eliminate the swarm vanguard in that region, but the collateral damage to nearby Accord territories, the sheer release of uncontained vacuum energy, will be catastrophic, even with our best shielding. It will be, Vance agreed calmly. But the alternative is the swarm consuming the galaxy sequentially, utilizing our technology against us as they adapt. We calculated the maximum tolerable loss necessary to eradicate the core contagion. We chose the lesser, contained catastrophe over the infinite, sprawling one. This was the ultimate expression of the Deathworlder philosophy. Not hope, but necessary calculation of acceptable loss. They had engineered their own perceived defeat to ensure a strategic victory for a species they had only just met. Captain Vance, Arya said, her voice thick with an emotion she identified as all mixed with profound respect. You have presented us with a weapon and the tactical doctrine to wield it, a strategy so deeply rooted in self-sacrifice and cold logic that it transcends our understanding of ethical governance. Vance paused at the airlock, ready to return to his command post aboard the dying Argonaut. Ambassador, he stated, pulling the visor down, obscuring his face once more, sealing the human away behind the functional shell of the soldier. We are not concerned with ethics of governance when facing extinction. We are concerned only with the physics of survival. Integrate the data quickly. The calculation is absolute. Either you use our sacrifice to halt the plague, or you are simply the next biosphere consumed once the swarm follows the energy trail of our flight here. The airlock hissed shut, leaving Arya alone in the sterile bay, staring at the heavy gray silhouette of the Terran vessel, now humming faintly as the Accord engineers worked to integrate their brutal, brilliant technology. The mystery was solved. The reveal was complete. Humanity had arrived from SOS to invasion strategy, not by conquest, but by forcing the galaxy to confront a threat it was too civilized to recognize. The final mobilization was unprecedented. Xylosian coordination centers hummed with activity, directing fleets toward the predetermined kill zone coordinates, retrofitting drives with Terran kinetic projectors, and preparing for the moment the stellar disruption device would be activated. Captain Vance and Commander Sato were moved to the primary command hub aboard the Xylosian flagship, the Arbiter of Peace, a name now ringing with heavy irony. Progenitor Xyler addressed Vance directly across the command bridge, the holographic representations of Cathar strategists surrounding them, their violet forms tense with anticipation. Captain, the assimilation of the kinetic doctrine is 90% complete. We are prepared to launch the primary kinetic saturation barrage on your signal, synchronized with the activation sequence for the stellar device. We are relying entirely on your assessment of the swarm's vulnerability window. The window will be narrow, Progenitor, Vance replied, standing beside Sato, who monitored the deep space telemetry. The swarm responds to massive energy releases by immediately rerouting a significant portion of its collective consciousness to analyzing and isolating the source. That is their biological imperative, to understand the threat before consuming it. That analysis requires attention. That attention is the break in their synchronization. And the fallout from the stellar device? Xyler pressed, unwilling to sanction an action that might destabilize entire regions of the Accord. The device is angled to initiate a localized stellar implosion, creating a high-mass gravitational singularity intended to consume the bulk of the approaching wave, Sato interjected, her voice steady. The energy cascade will be immense, but the resulting singularity will pull the majority of the expanding debris field inward. The risk of sector contamination is calculated at 37% residual ionization, manageable with immediate deployment of Sylvani absorption fields. It is the lowest risk option for total eradication. The sheer audacity of planning a stellar collapse as a tactical option was breathtaking. This was not warfare, it was controlled cosmological demolition. 37% residual contamination is high, Xyler noted, weighing the ethical cost. It is the price of existence, Vance countered without rancor, merely stating a fact of their shared reality now. You must choose between controlled damage to your periphery or total loss of your core systems. The choice is mathematically obvious. The decision was ratified. The unified fleet moved into position, a vast, interlocking formation of Zalosian, Veldian, and Sylvani vessels, now bristling with Terran kinetic weaponry, a temporary, terrifying unity forged by the specter of the swarm. The moment arrived. Sensors registered the immense, undulating biological mass of the swarm closing on the pre-established trap coordinates, a dense cloud of consumption reaching across the vacuum, blotting out the light of distant stars. Progenitor, Vance stated, his hand hovering over the interface linked to the hidden stellar device. Commander Sato, initiate primary kinetic barrage sequence. Fire immediately on my mark. Sato confirmed the sequence. Thousands of massive, angular kinetic rounds, the brute force weapons designed by the Deathworlders, launched from the Allied fleet, striking the leading edge of the swarm. The impact was devastating. The crude energy transfer method shattered multiple layers of bioarmor, creating momentary, visible fissures in the collective entity. As predicted, the swarm recoiled, momentarily suspending its forward advance to process the novel, violent attack signature. Mark, Vance shouted, the single word cutting through the bridge noise. Sato slammed her hand onto the activation rune. Far out in the black, the dormant stellar device pulsed, not with light, but with an overwhelming gravitational distortion. A localized region of space began to warp inward violently, stars bending under the strain. The gravitational well grew exponentially, tearing at the fabric of the swarm mass that was closest to the engineered collapse. The resulting spectacle defied description, a cosmic vacuum cleaner designed by a desperate civilization. The swarm entity shrieked, a non-audible psychic scream of pure agony and confusion that slammed against the shields of the Allied fleet, triggering immediate, painful pressure feedback in the mental interface receptors of every Zalosian observer. For a terrifying, drawn-out moment, the collective mind of the swarm fractured. Localized units, separated from the main processing stream by the immense gravitational shearing, began to behave erratically. Some retreated, some attacked random targets, exhibiting the localized self-interest Vance had predicted. Now, Progenitor, Vance yelled. The window is open, saturate the fractured zones, do not allow them time to resynchronize. Xyler barked the command. The refitted fleet unleashed its kinetic payload, not aimed at shielding, but aimed at physical annihilation, hammering the momentarily confused biological structures with overwhelming, simple momentum. Waves of specialized projectiles tore through the exposed, unshielded biological pathways of the decentralized enemy units. The battle was not elegant. It was a grinding, physics-based slaughter. Over the next few brutal hours, the combined technological might of the Accord, guided by the precise, desperate doctrine of humanity, overwhelmed the compromised swarm vanguard. When the final, critical mass of the swarm was either consumed by the newly forming singularity or physically pulverized by the kinetic saturation, the tide turned. The psychic scream ceased, replaced by the chilling silence of void dominance. The cost was high. Several older Accord vessels suffered catastrophic damage from the energy discharge of the device, requiring immediate Sylvani shielding deployment to stabilize the surrounding space. But the threat, the consuming, intelligent plague, had been decisively stopped at the outer edge of the quarantined zone. Progenitor Xyler turned to Vance. the holographic representation showing clear signs of the strain the confrontation had placed on the ancient Cathar psyche. Captain Vance, Commander Sato, you have preserved the Accord. You have traded a devastating localized collapse for the continuation of billions of sentient lives. Humanity has proven itself not merely as a force of survival, but as a necessary, terrible equalizer in the calculus of galactic power. Vance nodded, the exhaustion finally showing in the slump of his shoulders. Sato, however, remained perfectly still. Her focus still locked on the long-range sensors, monitoring the residual energy signatures. Progenitor, Sato stated, her voice cutting through the atmosphere of tentative victory. The crisis in the quarantine zone is resolved. The vanguard has been neutralized. The primary threat vector has been eliminated. Xyler permitted a rare moment of relaxation. Then your people are safe. We will devote resources to establishing a secure, independent colony world for the surviving Terrans based on your preferred atmospheric parameters. The Accord owes you an immeasurable debt. Sato shook her head slowly, her eyes fixed on the sensor readings that showed the fading gravitational distortion of the stellar device. The debt is not yet settled, Progenitor, she stated, the realization dawning with chilling finality in the command hub. We delivered the weapon, and we gave you the doctrine to defeat the swarm, but the swarm was not the only entity responding to the signal. Vance, suddenly alert, moved back to the telemetry station beside her, his face grim. The SOS was a lure for the swarm, yes, Vance confirmed, his voice low and urgent, laced with a new, heavier dread. But the activation of the stellar device, the sudden, uncontrolled gravitational event, that was a signal beacon of a different nature. We calculated the energy release. We calculated the potential for attracting other attention. Xyler leaned forward, sensing the shift from relief to profound, cosmic terror. Other attention? Captain, what other entity could be drawn by the deliberate collapse of a star? Sato pointed to a sensor reading showing a faint, steady energy signature originating far beyond the edge of the known galaxy. A signal that had remained dormant, perhaps undetectable, until the sheer, violent distortion of the stellar collapse ripped a momentary hole in the local energy-dampening field. This signal, Sato explained, her voice tight with effort as she ran advanced spectral analysis, was dormant in this region of space for uncounted millennia. It registers as a highly structured, complex pattern, mathematically perfect yet utterly alien. It is not a distress signal. It is not a communication. Vance finished the thought, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried the full weight of universal uncertainty. It is an ancient, territorial marker. We just pulled the alarm on the system that predates the Accord, Progenitor. The swarm was merely the local predator attracted by the noise of our fight. Now, we have announced our presence to the true custodians of this void. On the projection screen, the faint, steady energy signature resolved into a repeating, three-dimensional glyph, an impossible structure of pure energy that spoke of technology and power beyond even the Cathar's deepest theoretical models. It was a vast, silent claim staking ownership over the very region of space the Accord considered its own. The initial relief evaporated, replaced by the chilling certainty that humanity, in its desperate, calculated act of survival, had not saved the galaxy, but had merely replaced one existential threat with an infinitely older, colder one. The fragile alliance solidified instantly, not out of gratitude, but out of shared, immediate peril. The Deathworlders, having demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of necessary brutality, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the civilized races, facing the true, ancient silence of the deep void, the final, cosmic frontier they had inadvertently awakened. The struggle for survival had only just truly begun.